Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. What looks like administrative confusion from the outside can be a ruler's answer to the problem of officials becoming too strong. The puzzle is not just who prevailed, but why did some rulers deliberately create confusing, overlapping offices instead of a single clear chain of command? The pressure is immediate. At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying because some states controlled the danger of overmighty officials less through direct surveillance of individuals than through structural design that denied any one office. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate, the structure is exposed. Why did some rulers deliberately create confusing, overlapping offices instead of a single clear chain of command? That is the tension the institution has to absorb before uncertainty becomes political opportunity. The problem begins when a highly efficient single chain of command can also become the easiest route by which one talented official turns delegated authority into a rival center of power. Once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The relevant distinction is the difference between monitoring a strong individual and designing the institution so no office can become strong enough to dominate alone. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all. When that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. The structure feels fragile. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is institutional pluralism as an internal power-checking mechanism, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. Institutional pluralism as internal control. How overlapping jurisdictions, redundant offices, and rival chains of authority can check the rise of any one dominant official. The distinction matters here. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis then is deliberately simple to state and much harder to build in practice. Some states controlled the danger of overmighty officials less through direct surveillance of individuals than through structural design that denied. The basic insight is uncomfortable for lovers of neat organization. Maximum clarity is not always maximum safety for a ruler. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A perfectly unified office can move quickly, but it can also accumulate information, patronage, and dependence in ways that make it politically dangerous. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Overlapping jurisdictions answer this by ensuring that major functions require multiple offices, multiple signatures, or multiple channels of confirmation. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. That overlap is costly in efficiency, yet it can be valuable in political security because it becomes harder for one actor to own the whole process. That is the mechanism. Rival offices also generate comparison. When two institutions touch the same problem, the center gains more than one vantage point on what is happening. That is the mechanism. The design therefore shifts the problem from trusting one powerful official to managing friction among several less complete ones. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. That friction is intentional when used well, because delay and mutual dependence can be safer than elegant speed concentrated in one pair of hands. That is the mechanism. This does not mean rulers wanted paralysis. It means they often preferred manageable inefficiency to the risk of building an official too indispensable to discipline. That is the mechanism. Institutional redundancy also spreads patronage, reducing the chance that one office monopolizes access, reward, and loyal subordinates across the whole state. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The same design can help expose ambition, because an official who wants to bypass peers or merge functions reveals their hunger for unchecked control. That is the mechanism. Yet overlap creates its own danger. Officials can obstruct one another, hide behind divided responsibility, or convert caution into stagnation. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. So the design works only when the center can still arbitrate among offices faster than the offices can neutralize one another completely. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. That is why overlapping jurisdiction is not disorder by accident. It is a political technology for limiting concentration through structured incompleteness. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The ruler effectively says, no one office will be allowed to become the state by itself, even if that means the state must move less cleanly. That is the mechanism. The strategic question is whether the security gain from divided authority outweighs the administrative cost created by that division. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A fair counterpoint is that some overlapping offices are simply clutter, not clever design, and not every messy administration is strategically intentional. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. The limitation is that it can be difficult to distinguish deliberate redundancy from accidental overlap in the absence of reliable supporting factual detail. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. The mechanism fails when overlap produces paralysis so severe that the state cannot act coherently even though no single official has become dangerously strong. The limits still matter. There is also exception in moments of acute crisis, when temporary concentration may be necessary because divided authority cannot respond fast enough. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate because a well-balanced internal check can still serve oppressive or exclusionary political ends. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Even so, the pattern remains useful. Where rulers intentionally divide authority across partially overlapping offices, ambitious officials often find it harder to capture an entire function outright. The limits still matter. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. Some rulers created overlapping offices because structural redundancy could check the rise of overmighty officials more reliably than trusting one efficient chain of command to remain politically harmless. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. The explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking whether apparent inefficiency is accidental clutter or a deliberate defense against concentration. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. Authority moves through institutions, and institutions sometimes protect themselves not by speeding everything up, but by making capture harder. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. Remove the ceremonial surface, and the deeper question becomes which office can act alone, which office needs peers, and who benefits from that dependency. This outcome cannot be reduced to bureaucratic incompetence alone, because some friction is the price of keeping power fragmented on purpose. Ask the structural question. Strategic effectiveness is not legitimacy, yet the lesson remains that not every clean hierarchy is politically safe for the center that built it. Ask the structural question. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains whether a state can divide power enough to stay politically secure without dividing action so much that the institution becomes slow, evasive, or self-canceling. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.